Good evening. It is time for today's Tax Talk. I'm your host. I'm attorney Stephen Leahy. It is Thursday, March 16th, the year of our Lord 2023, day before St. Patty's Day. Looking forward to it, as I am every year. So thanks so much for joining us. We're going to talk today about the IRS and the $80 billion again. And something unusual in that the Taxpayer Advocate came out about how they should spend that money. Little surprise. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Won't you join us? Anyway, that's where we are. We on this show we talk a lot about. I know the IRS uses the tax gap as the boogeyman for everything. Oh, it's the tax gap because the tax gap. Everybody's a thief and a liar, and most Americans, they're not paying their taxes. We don't pay enough taxes, and we're going to stop all those thieves. Is that really what's happening? Is that your experience as an American taxpayer out there talking to everybody? Do you believe that most people are stealing from the IRS? You say, well, I know people who don't pay their taxes. Do you? Really? I mean, if someone tries to I know people who they try to take their dinner off. I mean, is that really what's this? We gave billions to the Ukraine. How much are we giving to the banks? How much? And that we're going to go after somebody, the waiters and waitresses now because they're not paying enough on their tips. This is what we're going to worry about. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think, most of us, if we think about it, know that this doesn't really make any sense, right? That this isn't how you fix this. But again, the tax gap is a big deal. They've made a big deal about it. And so then let's start with this. I'll start with this story here. Would increased funding for the IRS narrow the tax gap? And to me, I don't know who this Peter J. Peterson Foundation is. I don't know who that is. But it seems like this just seems like the IRS wrote this for themselves. The Inflation Reduction Act, which became law in August 2022, includes a provision that increased the budget of the Internal Revenue Service by $80 billion over 10 years. The Biden administration and many other observers, the Biden administration and other Democrats, argue that increased funding for the IRS will enhance tax enforcement efforts, which would help narrow the tax gap. The nearly $500 billion. Now, I don't know, again, it was 200. Now, a couple months ago, they've reported that we went back and looked. It's much higher than we thought because they were always reporting it at about $220 billion. And remember, it's just an estimate. They don't know for sure what it is. It's an estimate because you can't know. By its very nature, you can't know. That nearly $500 billion annual difference between the total amount of taxes owed and the amount actually collected. Here we examine the increase in funding in greater detail by analyzing the extent to which more funding impacts tax compliance, the tax gap, and federal revenues. What is the current state of the IRS's enforcement capabilities? And this is where I think that this is the argument all the time, and that I think is an empty. It's a shell of an argument. But let's get to it. The IRS is responsible for processing hundreds of millions of returns submitted every year by taxpayers, and for ensuring that non-compliant taxpayers or entities pay what is owed. A substantial portion of the IRS's total annual budget goes toward enforcement activities, such as investigations, exams, and collections, and regulatory compliance. The remainder of the IRS's budget goes to taxpayer services, operation support, and business systems modernization. Despite its crucial role in ensuring tax compliance, the IRS has faced funding cuts for many years. According to the report from the Congressional Budget Office, total appropriations for the IRS fell by 20% between 2010 and 2018, the most recent year for which complete data was available. while the total number of employees at the agency fell by 22% over the same period. Now, does it make sense to you that maybe if they cut 20% of their employees, that their budget would be cut by 20%? Kind of makes sense to me. I don't think they're probably not one-to-one. It's probably not one-to-one, but you can see that they're lowering costs, a big portion of their budget, and I've seen this. They used to be able to a big portion of their budget went to tax the tax return and them processing those tax returns, right? And now, because as this article points out, they do hundreds of millions of tax returns per year. And when you did it by hand, man, that was a big task every year. And a lot of people were assigned to do that. But since 2010, now almost 95% of all tax returns and more, because the IRS is requiring more and more of these returns, not only tax returns, but the payroll tax returns and all of those to be filed electronically. Well, why do they do that? Why are they making them file electronically? Because it's easier, right? They don't have the employees to handle it. They don't need them. It's done automatically. You can tell that by what's going on with in the last 2 years when they cut back on the personnel. If you filed electronically, there wasn't really much of a delay on your tax return being processed and you getting your refund. But if you filed a paper copy, well, that took 2 years to process, right? Well, for one of the reasons why is because all the IRS employees were at home. So how could they process them? So they didn't. But the electronic ones, they didn't need anybody in the office. They were processed. Let's remember that when we think about these numbers. And so they're always telling us that it's one-to-one, right? Well, look, they have less money than they had before, and that's what the problem is. That's not the problem. That's not what happened. That's my opinion. What's more, the total number of employees dedicated to enforcement declined by 30%. How much more of enforcement now is done electronically? On the show, we talk a lot about the CP 2000, 2001, which is when the IRS will electronically compare W-2s, 1099s to your tax return automatically. They don't need people to do that. And that's why they reduce the enforcement also. So they're like, well, they're not enforcing, so nobody's paying taxes anymore. Is that your experience? They decline. The dedicated enforcement declined 30% from $50,000 to $35,000. So here is the budget in 2018 dollars. So that's why it looks like this is less, but it's really in actual dollars it went up. Okay, so if you think that they cut the budget of the IRS, they never did cut the budget of the IRS. They cut the increase. It went up every year. They just didn't go up. Well, it didn't keep up with inflation. Again, it didn't have to keep up with inflation. The number of people required to do the job fell. And I don't know if we reported on this show. Now they're using scanners, which they should have been doing for 10 years plus. And they're processing all these returns, these paper returns. Remember, in 2021, they destroyed 30 million information returns, paper, because they couldn't process them. They didn't have scanners. They were processed by hand. Now they're using scanners. Oh, and let's look at this budget a little bit more closely. Here we see business systems modernization. That's the top one. $310 million, $310 million, $380 million, $350 million, $300 million a year they're spending in, and they tell you, well, everybody knows the IRS information system or business systems, they're antiquated. Well, 3 years is $1 billion. You could buy a lot of computer programs for $1 billion, don't you think? As the size of the IRS's budget and workforce declined, so did the agency's ability to improperly enforce tax compliance. Again, is that your experience? That now you can walk away, you don't have to pay your taxes? The IRS will leave you alone? Is that what you've experienced? For example, the audit coverage rate, which is the number of audits closed and in process compared to the total number of returns filed in that tax year, fell by 50%, the most recent year for which complete data is available. More specifically, the examination rate for individual income taxes fell by 49% over that period, while the rate for corporate income taxes fell by 57%. The decline in the examination rates for both individual and corporate rate taxes led to a considerable reduction in the total amount of additional taxes and penalties recommended by the IRS after audit, which in turn increases the total amount of unpaid tax debt and widened the tax gap. If they don't audit it and they don't owe it, then is that an increase in the tax gap? And I don't know I'm not sure what they're calling an examination here. And as I mentioned, much more enforcement has gone to electronic comparing your 1099s and other information returns to tax returns. I don't think that's what they're counting as an examination, because those numbers are up. 4.7 billion information returns last year, actually 2 years ago. Last year, we don't have the number yet. What is the tax gap? Simply put, the tax gap is a difference between the total amount of federal taxes owed by the taxpayers and the actual amount paid on or before the filing date. According to the most recent data available for the IRS, the average annual gross tax gap between 14 and 16 was estimated at $496 billion. They just raised this, almost doubled it a couple months ago. They came out, we're going to go back to 14 and 16, and those numbers were wrong. We're redoing it. It was actually almost $500 billion every year. Some people will say it's $1 trillion a year. About 70% of that gap was owed in individual income taxes. Okay, let's think about that. If they're trying to shrink the tax gap, and that's what they're trying to do, and 70% of that is from individual tax returns, how many of that was from people making over $1 billion or $400,000 a year? What percentage? If their goal is to close the tax gap and 70% is from individual income tax returns, how many of those are going to be from people making over $400,000? The answer is very little of that 70%, right? So who is going to get audited more, and who are they going to get the money from? Regular folks. If you call it regular folks, anybody makes less than $400,000 a year. According to the analysis by Congressional Research Service, the vast majority, 80% of the average annual gross tax gap between 14 and 16 came from incorrect reporting, specifically underreporting income or overreporting adjustments and credits. IRS enforcement activities between 14 and 16 were only able to reduce the individual income tax gap by $51 billion, the employment tax gap by $6 billion, and the corporate tax gap by $8 billion. As a result, the net tax gap, the amount of tax that remains unpaid after the IRS enforcement activities or delayed payments are collected, is roughly $428 billion. Again, where do they get that number? They made that number up. They don't know the number. In a report from May 2021, the Department of Treasury highlights the inverse correlation between the dwindling IRS enforcement capabilities and the growth of the tax gap, because it's built into their model. That's why it's directly correlated, because they have a model, and they base that model on how many people they have. Exploiting the growth from the IRS's 2011 to 2013 data on the tax gap, Treasury projects that in light of reduced funding from the IRS and the associated drop in staff, the tax gap for 2019 could have been as high as $630 billion. With roughly $3.6 trillion in taxes owed and just $3 trillion paid voluntarily. The tax gap of that magnitude carries with it significant fiscal implications. For one thing, $630 billion is owed, but unpaid taxes in 2019 is equal to 64% of the $984 billion deficit that year. Do you really believe that if the IRS collected $630 billion more, that the tax gap or the budget deficit would have shrunk? Well, by definition, Attorney Leahy. Do you know, let's go back here because I have. Do you know, let's see if I can find it. I got this. Here is this. This is the gross collections by the IRS from the years 2012 to 2021. The top line is the total line. Do you see that line? It's going, for the last year, it spiked. Every year is a record. They collect more money every year than they ever have before. So if the tax gap is getting bigger and they're collecting more money, how could it be getting bigger? Are we all making so much more money, or the tax rate's going up so high that that the taxes that we just are supposed to pay so much more in taxes? It just doesn't make any sense. Many policymakers argue that increasing funding for the IRS to bolster its enforcement capabilities would help narrow the tax gap. A report by the Congressional Research Service notes that the size of the IRS budget and staff affects the level of taxpayer compliance and taxpayer services conducted by the agency. Due to the funding shortages, the number of revenue agents who are responsible for administering the most complex enforcement cases fell by 35% and officers by 48%. Those reductions led to a decrease in audit rates. For example, between 2010 and 18, the audit rate for individuals with incomes above $1 million dropped by 61%. It stands to reason that if funding and staffing shortages were addressed, the IRS's ability to better enforce tax compliance would improve, and the tax gap would shrink, thereby improving the nation's fiscal picture. Really? Spending $80 billion on a government agency additional, because remember, that doubles the number of people that are going to work there, but it doesn't double their budget. So their budget is now over $20 billion a year. Broken down, if you break this $80 billion up over 10 years. $20 billion a year. While the increased funding would go towards a variety of IRS activities, 58% is directed towards enforcement activities. So of the $80 billion, last year they were answering, like the IRS wasn't answering 90% of their calls. But most of this money is going towards enforcement. 58% is directed towards enforcement activities, which would increase the agency's ability to perform audits and collect taxes owed. Again, on who? Didn't they tell us that it was only going to be on people making over $400,000? That's not where the tax gap is. Decreasing the tax gap as a result. CBO estimates that the increased funding would yield additional revenues of $186 billion over the 2023 through 2032 period. So they're going to get additional revenues of $86 billion. But they're spending an additional $80 billion. So $100 billion, and who are they going to drag that out of? Regular Americans. The IRS is expected to face difficulty hiring experienced revenue agents. Well, there aren't any. The revenue agents work for the IRS already, who have specialized areas of knowledge, which will result in a delay in additional tax revenues in the first few years after the increase in funding. Once the IRS is able to hire and train new agents, additional revenues are projected to grow substantially as a result of increased enforcement activity. Because the additional $80 billion in IRS funds is only available through 2031, a significant drop in annual additional federal revenues is projected. So watch out, we're not going to have the money now. The IRS has faced funding and staffing shortages for years. I don't buy it. Resulting in less robust annual tax collections and a widening tax gap. I think it's made up, which have raised questions about fairness and our fiscal outlook among many policymakers and citizens. Shouldn't it be fair to the taxpayer? Analysis, well, people are cheating, Attorney Leahy. There's no, again, in your own experience, do you think that that's what's happening? Analysis from CBO concludes that providing additional funding and resources to the IRS to bolster its enforcement capabilities would have a positive effect on accuracy on the collection of taxes owed as defined under existing law and subsequently on federal revenue, the tax gap, and the deficit. There'll be bigger compliance because people will be scared to death of the IRS, as they already are. Do you think the people are afraid of the IRS? So I wanted to... I took too much time going through it. Taxpayer Advocate urges Congress to reconsider $80 billion in IRS funding boost. The office within the IRS that advocates on behalf of of regular taxpayers says the $80 billion funding boost for the agency passed last year is skewed too much toward enforcement and audits and not enough towards helping people file their taxes. Of the funding provided by Congress to the IRS over the next decade as part of the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act, $45.6 billion is set to go towards pursuing tax cheats, and they're not tax cheats, with more audits and additional enforcement measures. The second biggest chunk, $25 billion, is going toward a general operation support. Only $3.2 billion is going to the Taxpayer Services, which is a segment meant to help the IRS answer questions over the phone and deliver more reliable service. And only $4.8 billion is being given to the IRS to update its technology, which is famously out of date. I already kind of addressed that. Ahead of the more detailed breakdown of the allotment that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said on Thursday would be coming in the next few weeks. The Taxpayer Advocate is saying these numbers don't make sense for families and businesses. The IRS allocated the funds in a manner that does not address the needs of the U.S. taxpayers, including individuals, families, and businesses. The top tax administration priority now should be to improve taxpayers' service, particularly after the struggles of the last few years. And to do that, the IRS needs more funding in the taxpayer services accounts. The Taxpayer Advocate may make recommendations to Congress, but cannot change policy. Republicans have been up in arms about the funding boost to the IRS in general, as well as a relatively small amount reserved for taxpayer services compared to the enforcement and operational budget. When they cut the budget, when they passed that law in January, cut this $80 billion, they left that much money in there. Only $3.2 billion, under 4% of the IRS funding influx, will be dedicated to taxpayer services. Given Americans have long dealt with abysmal IRS service, the pauper sum for fixing IRS's customer service is indefensible. It lays bare that the most Democratic colleagues have less concern about poor IRS service and utmost interest in the IRS squeezing more money from American taxpayers. I would say that anything that's not used directly for taxpayer services, any dollars that don't go into taxpayer services, ought to be frozen in place until the IRS submits a plan. Because remember, they haven't submitted that plan. The Democrats' rationale behind the new funding for enforcement is that most of the money that the government is owed every year but isn't able to collect, a sum known as the tax gap, is stashed away in individual business income accounts that require well-trained auditors to be able to collect. The tax gap totaled about $428 billion a year between 14 and 16, the last time it was comprehensively measured by the IRS. No, it wasn't. Of that amount, uncollected individual income tax totaled $278 billion, and the largest segment of that was in business income at $130 billion. While it's important to the IRS to collect more of the money that's owed the government, the remarks made Thursday by the Taxpayer Advocate indicate that the priority needs to be balanced with an acceptable level of service to tax filers. The additional funding provided by the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, while appreciated and welcomed, I don't know by whom, is disproportionately allocated for enforcement activities and should be reallocated to achieve the better balance with taxpayer service needs and IT modernization. We need to put taxpayers first. Well, that'll be the day. Right? That'll be the day. So anyway, that's where we are, the tax gap. I want to thank you so much for joining us. I have more stories, but I don't have time to get to them. So sorry about that. But remember, I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. I need your help to get this information out. So please like and subscribe. And also, if you have an IRS problem, if you're facing trouble, if you owe the IRS money and don't know what to do, then you should go to freeirsbook.com, get a copy of my book, Deal with Your IRS Problem Today. Go to freeirsbook.com. That's freeirsbook.com. Get your free copy. I will pay for the publishing if you pay for the shipping and handling. So go to freeirsbook.com. So thanks so much for joining us here today. I appreciate it. And we will be back on Monday. I hope you can join us then. In the meantime, God bless. Have a happy St. Patrick's Day. And we are now out.